The year was 1963. While her neighbors rushed to the brand-new savings bank downtown, Marvella quietly closed her kitchen drawer. No fanfare, no celebration, just a small, knowing smile. She was 38 years old, raising 3 children on her husband's modest factory wage. By every measure, she should have been struggling. But she wasn't. Her pantry was full, her bills were paid, and hidden somewhere inside that modest little house on Birchwood Lane was a financial system no bank had ever taught her. But what happened next, no one saw coming. Her real advantage wasn't a bigger paycheck, it was something far more powerful. Marvella woke before sunrise. Not because she had to, because she chose to. That quiet hour before the children stirred and before her husband, Roy, left for the factory floor was hers, and she used every minute of it with purpose. She stood in her kitchen, pencil in hand, studying a handwritten list on yellowed notebook paper. Not a grocery list exactly, something deeper than that, something most people in 1963 wouldn't have thought to write down at all. It was a list of what her family truly needed to survive a hard month. Not wants, not conveniences, needs. And slowly, quietly, week by week, she was building all of it. The first thing you noticed walking into Marvella's pantry was the smell. Warm, dry, faintly sweet from the mason jars of preserved peaches lined along the back shelf. Rows of canned green beans, sacks of flour and cornmeal tied at the top with simple twine, salt, sugar, dried lentils in old coffee tins. It didn't look like wealth, not to anyone passing through, but Marvella knew something her neighbors didn't. When prices at the grocery store crept upward, as they always eventually did, her family wouldn't feel it, not right away, not like everyone else would. Because she wasn't storing money, she was storing value. There is a profound difference between the two. Every paycheck, before a single dollar went anywhere else, Marvella set aside a small portion, not for a savings account, not for a certificate of deposit at the downtown bank everyone was so excited about. She bought things, real, useful, lasting things. A second pair of good work boots for Roy before the winter came, an extra wool blanket while the dry goods store still had them on clearance, 3 extra tins of coffee when she spotted them reduced by a nickel each. She understood something quietly revolutionary. A dollar saved in a bank account in 1963 would be worth slightly less by 1964. Inflation was slow but steady, like water wearing down stone. But a pair of boots bought today would still be a pair of boots next winter. A pantry filled with flour didn't lose value the way paper did. Her purchases weren't impulsive, they were intentional, calculated with a patience that felt almost old-fashioned even then. Across town, at that shiny new savings bank with its gleaming glass windows and cheerful tellers, Marvella's neighbor Dorothy was depositing her extra money every Friday like clockwork. Dorothy felt modern, responsible, smart, and she was, in her own way. But when the grocery prices jumped unexpectedly that autumn, Dorothy quietly cut back on meals, adjusted the family menu, felt the pinch in small daily ways that added up to something uncomfortable. Marvella's family ate the same that autumn as they had in summer. No adjustments, no quiet sacrifices at the dinner table, no conversations lowered to whispers after the children went to bed. Just steady, uninterrupted life. There was nothing glamorous about what Marvella did. She didn't talk about it over the backyard fence. She didn't recommend it to friends or explain her thinking at church socials. She simply acted every week with a consistency that looked almost boring from the outside. But inside that modest house, behind that pantry door, something powerful was growing. A buffer between her family and the unpredictable world outside. A quiet wall built one small purchase at a time. She ran her hand along the cool glass of the mason jars one morning, counting silently, Then she closed the pantry door and picked up her pencil again. She wasn't finished preparing. The envelope was nothing special, plain white, the kind you could buy 50 of for a dime at the five and dime store on Main Street. Marvella had written on the front in her careful, slanted handwriting just one word: emergencies. She tucked it behind the flour canister on the second shelf, not hidden exactly, but not visible either, somewhere that required intention to reach. That small distance mattered more than anyone would have guessed. Every Friday evening, after supper was cleared and the children were doing their homework at the kitchen table, Marvella performed a ritual that never changed. Roy handed her his pay envelope. She opened it at the counter, back turned slightly, not from secrecy, but from concentration. Her lips moved faintly as she counted. Then she divided. Not randomly, not based on feeling, based on a system she had worked out years ago on a sheet of paper that was now so folded and refolded it felt like soft cloth in her hands. A portion for the landlord, a portion for groceries, a smaller portion for utilities, and then, before anything else had a chance to claim it, a quiet slice slipped into that plain white envelope behind the flour. The rest stayed in a separate jar. Week money, she called it, for the ordinary expenses life would bring between now and the next Friday. Once the jar was set, it was set. There was no going back to it early, no borrowing against next week, no telling herself she would replace it by Tuesday. The jar said what it said, and Marvella listened. Temptation came, of course. It always did. One Saturday afternoon in October, she passed the window display at Henderson's department store downtown. A beautiful winter coat, deep burgundy, fitted at the waist with large pearlescent buttons running straight down the front. She stopped walking. Her old coat was serviceable, still warm enough, but it was her third winter wearing it, and the lining had started to thin at the elbows. She stood at that window longer than she intended. Inside the store, she could see the sales clerk arranging a second coat on the mannequin. The lighting was warm. The store smelled faintly of cedar and new fabric. Her hand moved toward the door handle. Then she thought about the envelope behind the flour canister. She thought about Roy's back, which had been bothering him lately, about Tommy needing new school shoes before December, about the furnace that was making that low rattling sound it hadn't made last winter. She let go of the door handle, turned around, walked home in her old coat with the thinning lining, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not deprivation, not disappointment. Relief. This is the part that modern financial advice almost never discusses. The physical distance between a person and their money is not merely inconvenient, it is protective. When Marvella wanted something, she had to go home first, count what was actually in the jar, hold the real paper bills in her real hands, feel the weight of the decision before making it. Today, that distance has been completely erased. A coat seen on a screen at midnight can be purchased before the thought is fully formed. A single tap, a saved card number, a confirmation number glowing in the dark. No envelope, no jar, no walk home, no moment of pause between desire and consequence. Marvella's system wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't designed by a financial planner or tested in a university study. It was simply human, built around the honest truth that people need friction between wanting and spending. She had built that friction into the physical architecture of her home. The envelope behind the flour grew slowly, not dramatically, not in a way that would impress anyone. $1 here, 50 cents there. Some weeks nothing at all if the expenses pressed close, but it grew. And more importantly, it remained. Through small crises and minor emergencies and the ordinary surprises that every family faces, that envelope absorbed what needed absorbing without disturbing the rest of the system. One afternoon, her youngest daughter, Clara, found it while helping put away the groceries. "Mama, what's this?" Marvella took it gently from her small hands, tucked it back behind the flour, and smoothed Clara's hair. "That," she said quietly, "is peace of mind." Clara didn't fully understand, but she remembered. Years later, she would build her own system. Different jars, same principle. The lesson passing forward without a single lesson ever being formally taught. Marvella never once felt deprived by her own discipline. That surprised people who knew her well enough to notice. Frugality in that era was often worn like a hair shirt, something uncomfortable but necessary, something to endure. For Marvella, it was different. Her restraint felt like strength, like a muscle she had trained so long it no longer required effort. She spent on what mattered, she passed on what didn't, and the difference between those two categories had become, over years of quiet practice, perfectly clear to her. No app had taught her that clarity. No algorithm had refined it. She had earned it the slow way, through small daily decisions in an ordinary kitchen, with flour on her hands and a pencil behind her ear. But the strongest habit wasn't inside her house. It started with a simple plate of cornbread. Marvella had made too much one Thursday evening, more than her family could finish before it went dry. So she wrapped half of it in a clean dish towel and walked next door to Edna Pruitt's house without thinking twice about it. Edna was 61, widowed 2 years prior, living alone in a house that felt 3 sizes too large for one person. She opened the door and looked at that cornbread like it was something sacred. "You didn't have to do that," Edna said. "I know," Marvella answered, and went home. That was all. No calculation, no expectation, no ledger kept in the back of her mind. But something had quietly begun. Birchwood Lane in the early 1960s was not a wealthy street. Nobody drove a new car 2 years running. Nobody remodeled their kitchen on a whim. The houses were modest, the yards were small, and every family on that block understood the particular weight of a tight month. But what that street had, without ever naming it or organizing it formally, was a kind of invisible economy. It moved through dish towels and back fences and church parking lots and brief conversations on front porches in the early evening. Edna grew tomatoes in summer, more than she could ever eat alone. They appeared on doorsteps along the lane without announcement, just a brown paper bag, slightly damp, sitting quietly by the door. The Kowalski family, 2 houses down, had a husband who could fix almost anything mechanical. When Roy's push mower seized up in June, Stan Kowalski appeared in the yard on a Saturday morning with his toolbox. 2 hours later, the mower ran better than it had in years. Marvella repaid him the only way she knew how. 3 weeks of fresh baked bread left on his porch, every Monday morning without fail. No invoice, no negotiation, no transaction in any formal sense of the word. Just neighbors being quietly, practically useful to one another. The coupon exchanges happened on Tuesday mornings. A small group of women from the neighborhood gathered at rotating kitchen tables. Someone always had coffee ready, someone always brought something small to eat. But the real purpose was spread across the table in neat little stacks, clipped coupons, sorted by category, traded like a gentle, unhurried card game. Marvella didn't need the coupon for laundry powder that week, but Helen across the street did. Helen had 3 coupons for canned soup that she wouldn't use before they expired. Marvella needed soup. The exchange took 30 seconds. Both women left with more purchasing power than they had arrived with. No app facilitated this, no platform took a percentage, no algorithm decided what was relevant to show them. Just women sitting at a kitchen table, talking about their families, solving small problems together. The money they saved was real, but the thing that made it work was something no bank could offer: trust. Marvella had a particular skill with a sewing needle. She had learned from her mother, who had learned from hers. Hemming, patching, letting seams out as children grew, taking them in when fabric wore thin elsewhere. Word spread quietly, the way all good things spread on a street like Birchwood Lane. Soon she was mending things that didn't belong to her family: a winter coat for Edna, a school dress for the youngest Peterson girl, work trousers for Stan Kowalski that had torn badly at the knee. She never charged, but she was never empty-handed either. Garden vegetables appeared, a jar of homemade preserves, an afternoon of childcare when she needed to run errands without 3 children underfoot. A casserole left warm on the porch one evening when she had been fighting a cold all week and hadn't had the energy to cook. The whole street operated on a quiet, unspoken principle. What I have and don't need, you may have. What you have and don't need, I may have. And somewhere in that gentle circulation, everyone had enough. There is a term economists use for this kind of arrangement. They call it social capital. But Marvella wouldn't have recognized the phrase. She would have simply called it being a decent neighbor. What she understood intuitively was something that took academics decades to formally document: that strong community relationships have measurable economic value, that trust between neighbors reduces the cost of living in ways that no salary increase fully replicates. When you borrow a tool instead of buying one, your money stretches further. When a neighbor watches your children so you don't pay for childcare, your money stretches further. When fresh tomatoes appear on your doorstep in August, your grocery bill quietly shrinks. None of these transactions appeared in any bank statement. None of them generated interest or returned dividends, but they built something more durable than either. They built resilience. On a warm evening in late September, Marvella sat on her front porch watching the lane settle into its evening quiet. Edna was deadheading her roses next door. The Kowalski children were chasing fireflies in the yard. Somewhere down the block, someone was frying onions, and the smell drifted warm and golden through the air. She felt something she couldn't quite name. Not contentment exactly, something more active than that. Like being part of a system that worked, a living, breathing thing made of small kindnesses and practical arrangements and decades of accumulated trust. She thought about the women in the bank downtown, about the tellers behind their counters and the managers in their glass offices. They dealt in numbers. Birchwood Lane dealt in something else entirely, something that couldn't be deposited or withdrawn, something that grew quietly in the spaces between neighbors. Then came a month that tested everything. October arrived without warning that year. Not the season itself. The season came exactly as it always did, turning the maple at the end of Birchwood Lane from green to a deep burning amber. The air sharpened. The mornings grew dimmer earlier. What arrived without warning was the letter. Roy found it wedged between the electric bill and a seed catalog on a Tuesday afternoon. He stood in the kitchen doorway holding it, still in his factory coat, and Marvella knew from the way he held his shoulders what it said before he handed it to her. The factory was cutting hours. Not closing, not laying anyone off entirely, just trimming, reducing the overtime that had quietly become part of how they planned their monthly budget. Effective the 1st of November. Roy sat down heavily at the kitchen table. Marvella put the kettle on. She didn't panic. That was the first thing Roy noticed. He had expected something, a sharp intake of breath, a worried silence, the particular tension that moved through a house when the numbers stopped adding up. Instead, she set 2 cups on the table, sat across from him, and pulled out that soft, folded piece of paper from her apron pocket, the one with the numbers on it. She studied it for a long moment. Her pencil moved in small, quiet marks. Then she looked up. "We'll be all right," she said, not as reassurance, as a calculation. The weeks that followed revealed the true strength of everything she had built. The pantry absorbed the first blow without flinching. Grocery spending dropped by nearly a third because so much was already stored. The flour, the canned goods, the preserved peaches still lined up in their careful rows. They weren't emergency rations. They were simply dinner. The envelope behind the flour canister covered the month's unexpected cost when the furnace finally gave out on the third week of November. Not fully, but enough. Enough to pay the repairman and keep the heat running without touching anything else. She didn't replace the furnace, she repaired it. That distinction had guided her household decisions for years before this moment ever arrived. There was a coat rack beside the back door where the family's things hung in a particular order. Roy's factory coat, heavy canvas, 6 years old that autumn. The left cuff had been restitched twice. The collar lining had been replaced once by Marvella on a Sunday afternoon while Roy read the paper in the next room. He hadn't bought a new coat in 6 years because he hadn't needed one. Marvella's own coat, the burgundy one she had not bought at Henderson's department store 2 winters ago, did not exist on that rack. Her actual coat was 4 years old, practical, warm enough. The lining at the elbows had been reinforced with fabric cut from a worn-out skirt that had been folded in the rag bag for exactly this kind of moment. Nothing in that house was discarded before its full usefulness had been completely exhausted. Broken things were fixed, worn things were mended, outgrown things were passed along the lane to families whose children were younger and still growing into them. The rag bag in the corner of the sewing room was not a sign of poverty. It was a system. Tommy needed new school shoes that November. This was not a surprise. Marvella had watched his current pair through September and October, noting the wear on the left sole, the way the toe seam was beginning to separate. She had resoled them once already with a kit bought from the hardware store. They had given everything they had to give. She had set aside a small specific amount for this exact eventuality over the preceding 2 months. Not because she had known precisely when it would happen, but because she knew shoes wore out, children grew, and prepared people didn't treat predictable expenses like emergencies. She bought the shoes, sturdy ones, a size larger than he currently needed to allow room for growth. She packed the toes lightly with newspaper until his feet caught up. It was a small thing, a completely ordinary thing, but in a month when the budget had been compressed from one direction by the factory's reduced hours, that small act of forward thinking held the line without drama or sacrifice. Across town that same November, a young couple Marvella barely knew from church was navigating the same factory news very differently. Their refrigerator had stopped working 2 weeks prior. Rather than repairing it, they had bought a new one on installment credit in September, quietly stretching their monthly obligations a little further. Their pantry held perhaps 4 or 5 days of food at any given time because modern grocery shopping, they had been told, was most efficient done weekly in small quantities. They had no buffer envelope, no jar of week money, no carefully maintained rag bag in the corner of any room. When the overtime disappeared in their November paycheck, the distance between their income and their obligations became suddenly and uncomfortably visible. They were not foolish people. They were simply unprepared in the particular way that had become increasingly normal. Marvella didn't judge them. She brought them a casserole and 2 jars of preserved peaches from her pantry without making anything of it. That was the only sermon she ever preached on the subject. By the end of November, something remarkable had happened, or rather, something remarkable had not happened. The reduced income had arrived, the furnace had failed, the shoes had worn out, 3 genuine financial pressures in a single month, and the household on Birchwood Lane had absorbed every one of them. Not without effort, not without careful thought and quiet evenings at the kitchen table with a pencil and that worn piece of paper, but without debt, without panic, without the particular helplessness that comes from watching a crisis arrive and having nothing between yourself and it. Roy looked around the kitchen one evening near the end of the month, at the warm light, at the children doing homework, at the plate of food on the table that looked exactly like it always did. He shook his head slowly. "How do you do it?" he asked. Marvella refilled his coffee cup and sat back down. She thought about the pantry, the envelope, the lane of neighbors, the rag bag, the resold shoes, the 6 years of small, consistent, unglamorous decisions that had quietly constructed a life that bent without breaking. She didn't know how to explain all of that in a single answer, so she just said what was true. We never spent what we didn't have. Roy nodded slowly, like something had just settled into place. One final lesson remained.